The front doors of Vought Tower didn't explode. They slid open politely. Security cameras caught a bald man in a yellow jumpsuit stepping inside with a grocery bag in one hand and a receipt in the other. He paused just past the metal detectors, looked around at the marble lobby, and asked the nearest guard where customer service was. The guard told him to stop moving. He didn't. The first taser hit his neck and did nothing. The second snapped against his cheek and fell to the floor like a loose wire. When 4 guards tackled him at once, they all bounced off like they had jumped into a padded wall and collapsed in a pile of groaning bodies. Saitama looked down at them, confused, and apologized for bumping into people. Upstairs, alarms began screaming through Vought Tower. Executives froze. Security feeds replayed the same impossible moment from 3 angles. No one recognized the man. Homelander was called. Because something had just walked into Vought Headquarters that didn't act scared, didn't act impressed, and didn't act like the building meant anything at all. And this was only the first floor. You're about to see what happens when the world's most corrupt hero system meets someone who cannot be threatened, impressed, or controlled. Subscribe, because the consequences of this visit won't stay inside Vought Tower, and missing the next part means missing when everything starts breaking. The lobby of Vought Tower was designed to intimidate before anyone spoke a word. Marble floors polished to a mirror shine, 30-foot ceilings, giant digital walls looping footage of the 7 saving lives in slow motion. Everything in the space was built to make visitors feel small, watched, and slightly grateful to be allowed inside. Saitama didn't notice any of it. He stood just past the security gate, holding a grocery bag with one hand and a crumpled receipt with the other, looking around like someone who had entered the wrong department store. 4 security guards were still on the ground behind him, groaning and trying to figure out how they had failed to tackle a man who hadn't even resisted. Saitama scratched his cheek and looked toward the front desk. "Is this customer service?" he asked politely. The woman behind the counter didn't answer. She was staring at the monitors, replaying the moment the tasers hit him, and did nothing. Her hands were shaking as she pressed the silent alarm again, even though it had already been triggered. Within seconds, more guards flooded into the lobby from side corridors, rifles raised, voices overlapping, orders shouted in tones meant to regain control of a situation that had slipped too fast to understand. Saitama looked mildly concerned. "Sorry, I think I might be in the wrong place." They told him to get on the ground. He didn't. Not out of defiance. He simply didn't register that it applied to him. He took a step toward the desk to ask for directions. The entire line of guards opened fire. Rubber rounds hit his chest, his face, his neck, and dropped to the floor like pebbles. The sound echoed loudly through the lobby, but Saitama barely blinked. He glanced down at the pellets by his boots, then back at the guards with genuine confusion. "Are these part of the store policy?" he asked. Upstairs, alarms screamed through Vought Tower. Security feeds switched to every executive office. Employees stopped walking. Conversations died mid-sentence as screens showed the same surreal scene from multiple angles. A bald man in a yellow suit standing casually, while a full security team failed to move him an inch. Ashley Barrett was the first to speak in the executive floor war room. She asked the only question that mattered. "Who is he?" No one had an answer. Back in the lobby, 2 guards rushed him with batons. They swung hard, aiming for joints and head with trained precision. The batons snapped on impact like cheap plastic against reinforced steel. Both guards recoiled in pain, clutching their hands as if they had struck a wall. Saitama bowed slightly. Sorry, I didn't mean to be in the way." He took another step forward. The marble floor cracked under his foot with a sound like distant thunder. Not from force, just from the casual weight of someone who didn't realize how much pressure he applied to the world. The guards froze. They had dealt with Sups before. They knew strength. They knew enhanced durability. This wasn't that. This looked like someone walking normally through a space not built to handle him. On the executive floor, Ashley finally made the call. "Get Homelander." The elevators in the lobby dinged. Not the public ones. The private glass shaft that ran from the executive level straight to the ground floor. It descended smoothly into view like a stage reveal. Security instinctively backed away from Saitama, creating a wide, empty space without being told to. The doors opened. Homelander stepped out calmly, cape resting perfectly over his shoulders, eyes scanning the scene with measured control. He took in the cracked marble, the injured guards, the confused man in yellow holding a grocery bag, and the absolute lack of fear on that man's face. Saitama turned toward him. "Oh, hi, do you work here?" No one had ever spoken to Homelander like that inside Vought Tower. Homelander smiled the way he did for cameras, calm, reassuring, dominant. He walked forward slowly, maintaining eye contact. "You've caused quite a disturbance," he said evenly. Saitama nodded apologetically. "Yeah, I was just trying to find where to return this. They sold me a bad cabbage." He held up the grocery bag. Several guards stared at it, unsure if this was a joke, a trick, or something worse. Homelander didn't laugh. He stepped closer, just within arm's reach, letting the air between them thicken with pressure. Most people instinctively backed away when he did that. Saitama leaned slightly to the side to look past him at the reception desk. "Is that where customer service is?" he asked. Something shifted behind Homelander's eyes. He raised his hand and pressed it flat against Saitama's chest, then pushed with enough force to send armored vehicles skidding across asphalt. Saitama didn't move. He looked down at the hand on his suit. "Oh, are you checking temperature?" Homelander pushed harder. Nothing happened. The lobby was silent except for the alarms still echoing through the building. Cameras zoomed in from every angle. Executives upstairs leaned closer to screens, trying to understand why Homelander's posture had changed from relaxed control to visible effort. Homelander removed his hand slowly. Saitama smiled politely. "Sorry, I'm kind of hard to push." That was the first moment Homelander felt something he hadn't felt in years. Uncertainty. He stepped back half a pace, and his eyes glowed red. Heat vision burst forward, filling the lobby with blinding light. The beam hit Saitama square in the face, carved through the wall behind him, and exploded into the street outside in a shower of molten debris. When the light faded, Saitama was still standing there blinking. His head tilted slightly. Was that a laser? Behind him, the wall continued collapsing in chunks, dust filling the air while daylight poured through a hole that hadn't existed seconds earlier. Employees on upper floors screamed as part of the facade gave way. Saitama turned to look at the damage. "Oh, that's probably going to be expensive." He looked back at Homelander. "You should be more careful inside." Homelander didn't respond. He stared. Because for the first time in his life, someone had taken his full power head-on and treated it like mild inconvenience. And Saitama still hadn't raised his voice. The hole in the lobby wall turned the entire first floor into an open-air stage. Wind poured in from the street, carrying dust, sirens, and the distant sound of people shouting outside. Employees on upper balconies leaned over railings despite orders to stay back, unable to stop watching the man in yellow standing calmly in the middle of the wreckage. Homelander didn't move. He was still staring at Saitama like the world had just misbehaved in front of him. Saitama, meanwhile, was peering through the broken wall at the street. "Did something explode?" he asked casually. "I heard a noise." The elevators opened again. This time it wasn't security. It was the 7. Queen Maeve stepped out first, jaw tight, eyes immediately scanning the scene for threats. A train followed, breathing fast from a sprint he hadn't needed to make. The Deep lingered behind them, visibly confused. Black Noir said nothing, already assessing angles and exits. They had all seen the security feed. They had all seen Homelander's lasers do nothing. Maeve's eyes settled on Saitama. That's him. Ashley's voice crackled through their earpieces. Do not engage unless Homelander gives the order. But nobody needed the order, because Saitama waved at them politely. Oh, are you all staff? The Deep looked personally offended. A train circled behind Saitama at super speed, trying to get a read from multiple angles. From Saitama's perspective, nothing happened. He felt a faint breeze and scratched his cheek. A train stopped abruptly, frowning. He didn't even react. Maeve stepped forward slowly. Sir, you need to leave the building. Saitama nodded. Yeah, I think I will. I don't think this is the right store. He took a step toward the exit. The marble floor split further under his foot. Everyone flinched except him. Homelander moved instantly, grabbing Saitama by the shoulder and lifting him off the ground. He shot straight upward, smashing through the lobby ceiling into the atrium above. Glass rained down. Employees screamed and scattered as the two figures vanished through multiple floors in a blur. Saitama dangled in Homelander's grip, looking mildly uncomfortable. Oh, elevator would have been fine. They burst out onto the rooftop in a violent explosion of debris. Homelander slammed Saitama into the concrete hard enough to crack the entire surface. The impact sent shockwaves through the building's structure, rattling windows across multiple floors. Saitama looked up at the sky. Nice view. Homelander hovered above him, breathing harder now, eyes glowing again. This wasn't for show. This wasn't for cameras. This was personal confusion turning into force. He unleashed heat vision again. The beam carved a line across the rooftop, slicing through air conditioning units and sending molten metal spraying across the roof. When the light faded, Saitama was still lying in the crater, staring up. He raised one hand. Are you angry? Homelander stopped, because no one had ever asked him that without fear. Saitama sat up and dusted his shoulder. You should be careful. This place looks expensive. Below them, the rest of the seven burst onto the rooftop access level. Maeve was first to see it clearly. Homelander hovering. Saitama sitting casually in a cracked crater like he had tripped on a sidewalk. She slowed. Her voice dropped. Homelander, what is he? Homelander didn't answer. A train tried something reckless. He darted forward at full speed, intending to knock Saitama off balance. He hit Saitama's shoulder like a car hitting a brick wall and flipped backward through the air, slamming into a ventilation unit and collapsing in a dazed heap. Saitama turned his head slightly. Did someone bump into me? Maeve felt it then. This wasn't a fight. This was the seven throwing themselves at a man who didn't understand he was being attacked. Black Noir moved next. Silent, precise, tactical. He drew blades and aimed for joints, neck, eyes. Every strike landed perfectly and did nothing. The blades bent. One snapped. Noir paused for the first time in years. Saitama looked at the broken blade on the ground. You guys really need better equipment. The Deep didn't even step forward. He was watching Homelander now. Because Homelander wasn't commanding the situation anymore. He wasn't speaking. He was staring at Saitama like he was trying to solve a problem that had no category. Maeve finally said what no one else wanted to. Homelander, this isn't working. Saitama stood up fully and stretched his back. So, where is the exit? He walked past them. Not pushing, not rushing, just walking. Maeve instinctively stepped aside. Black Noir stepped aside. A train stayed down. Homelander turned slowly in the air, watching Saitama approach the rooftop door like a man leaving a grocery store. And for the first time since the seven had formed, none of them were the most dangerous thing in the room. They were just obstacles someone polite was trying not to bump into. The executive war room at Vought Tower had stopped sounding like a crisis center and started sounding like a research lab in panic. Every screen showed a different angle of the same impossible problem. Homelander's heat vision doing nothing. A train bouncing off a man who didn't even notice. Black Noir's blades bending like aluminum against reinforced steel. The cracked floors, collapsed walls, and the quiet way the man in yellow kept apologizing while walking through it all. Ashley stood at the head of the table, gripping a tablet so tightly her knuckles were white. Pull every database, every classified file, every failed prototype. I want to know if we've ever seen anything like this. They hadn't. There was no compound V signature, no known enhancement markers, no history in their system. Facial recognition came back empty across federal, international, and underground networks. He didn't exist. Down below, Saitama stepped into a stairwell and began walking down calmly, humming to himself. The door had been designed to withstand riots and forced entry. The hinges tore free when he pushed it open without realizing how much force he used. Chunks of reinforced metal clanged down the stairwell behind him. He paused and looked back. Oh, that was fragile. Security teams scrambled to reposition on lower floors, trying to anticipate where he would come out next. None of them were prepared for the reality that he wasn't sneaking, running, or avoiding anything. He was just looking for the way out. On the rooftop, Homelander landed heavily. Maeve watched his expression carefully. She had seen him angry. She had seen him proud. She had seen him unstable. She had never seen him confused. "He's not fighting you," she said quietly. Homelander didn't respond. Because that was the part that unsettled him most. This man wasn't resisting. He wasn't challenging. He wasn't trying to win. He was uninterested. Back in the war room, a senior analyst spoke up with forced calm. "We should consider this a hostile asset. Deploy full suppression protocol." Ashley nodded immediately. "Do it." Within seconds, orders were relayed to security teams carrying weapons reserved for rogue sups, high-density rounds, sonic disruptors, gas compounds designed to incapacitate enhanced physiology. None of them had been designed for someone who didn't fit into any known category. Saitama exited the stairwell onto a corporate office floor filled with cubicles and terrified employees hiding behind desks. He looked around awkwardly. "Sorry," he said, "is this the exit?" A woman pointed wordlessly toward the far end of the floor. Saitama nodded gratefully and began walking. The suppression team opened fire from both sides of the hallway. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. Rounds ricocheted off his suit and embedded into walls, computers, glass partitions. Gas canisters burst around him, filling the air with thick chemical fog that made employees choke and collapse. Saitama walked through the smoke, coughing slightly. "This place has terrible ventilation." He bumped into a row of cubicles while trying to see, sending an entire section toppling like dominoes. People screamed as desks and monitors crashed around them. Upstairs, Vought executives watched in horror as their own suppression protocol caused more damage to the building than Saitama had. Ashley whispered, "Stop firing, stop firing." The order came too late. The floor's sprinkler system activated from stray impacts, flooding the office with water. Electricity sparked. Screens went dark. People slipped trying to escape. Saitama stepped into the hallway at the end, dripping wet, still holding his grocery bag. "I think I'm close," he muttered to himself. In the stairwell behind him, a guard stared at his empty rifle and said the only thing anyone had been thinking. "This isn't a Supe." It wasn't said with relief. It was said with fear. Homelander reappeared on the executive floor without warning, moving fast enough to make the glass walls shudder. He walked straight into the war room where Ashley and the analysts froze mid-sentence. "What is he?" Homelander asked. No one answered. Because for the first time, Vought had nothing to sell him. No data, no narrative, no control. On the lower floors, Saitama finally found the lobby again. Water dripped from his suit as he stepped over debris and unconscious guards, looking around with mild embarrassment. "Sorry about the mess," he said to no one in particular. The front doors were visible now through the hole Homelander had burned earlier. He started walking toward daylight, and nobody in the building had any idea how to stop him from leaving. The moment Saitama stepped out through the shattered front of Vought Tower, the world outside became part of the problem. Police barricades had already formed after the explosion in the lobby wall. News vans lined the street. Civilians stood at a distance with phones raised, trying to capture footage of what they believed was another routine Supe incident unfolding inside corporate headquarters. They were not prepared for the sight of a bald man in a yellow jumpsuit walking calmly out of the building carrying groceries, while alarms screamed behind him. He paused on the sidewalk and squinted at the sunlight. "Oh good, exit." Several officers shouted commands immediately. Weapons raised. Megaphones ordered him to get on the ground. The tone was trained, authoritative, practiced for dealing with unstable sups in public spaces. Saitama looked around, confused by the noise. Is something happening? A police taser fired from 20 feet away and struck his chest. The wire snapped instantly and dropped uselessly to the pavement. The officer stared at the device in disbelief. Saitama gently peeled the barbs from his suit. "You dropped this." Behind him, employees and guards began pouring out of Vought Tower in a panicked wave, coughing from gas, soaked from sprinklers, screaming into phones. The building looked like it had been through a bombing, and the only person walking out calmly was the one everyone had been trying to stop. Cameras zoomed in. Reporters began shouting questions over each other. "Sir, are you a new Supe? Did Vought create you? What happened inside?" Saitama blinked at the microphones pointed at his face. I was just looking for customer service." The crowd laughed nervously. Not because it was funny. Because it didn't make sense. Up on a balcony overlooking the street, Homelander watched the scene unfold. The noise, the confusion, the way people were filming the man in yellow instead of looking at him. He could hear reporters repeating Saitama's words like they meant something. Customer service. The phrase echoed in his head in a way heat vision never had. Down below, a tactical police unit rushed Saitama from behind, trying to restrain him before the situation got worse. 6 officers grabbed his arms, legs, and shoulders at once. Saitama lost his balance slightly and stumbled forward. All 6 officers were dragged with him like attached luggage and slammed into the hood of a patrol car hard enough to dent the engine block. He froze, looking horrified. "Oh, sorry, I didn't see you there." The officers groaned in pain. The crowd stepped back. Because this didn't look like violence. It looked like gravity itself had changed rules around him. A helicopter hovered overhead, broadcasting live footage. The camera zoomed in on Saitama's face as he helped one of the officers sit up gently. "You okay?" he asked sincerely. No one knew how to respond to that. Inside Vought Tower, executives realized too late what had just happened. This was no longer a contained incident. This was now public, live, and impossible to spin. The narrative had escaped the building along with the man. Ashley yelled at a media team to cut feeds, to issue statements, to do something. But the footage was already everywhere. Saitama stepped away from the police car and looked up at the towering Vought logo above the entrance. "So this isn't a grocery store." Someone in the crowd shouted, "That's Vought Tower." He nodded slowly. Oh, that explains a lot. Behind him, the shattered lobby and broken facade made it very clear that something extraordinary had happened inside. Smoke drifted out of the building. Alarms still echoed faintly. And the man responsible for most of it looked mildly embarrassed. Homelander finally descended from the balcony, landing hard on the street in front of Saitama. The crowd gasped. Cameras swung toward him instinctively. This was the image they understood. The strongest hero in the world taking control of a dangerous situation. Saitama looked at him and waved. Oh, hi again. Homelander didn't wave back. He stood tall, cape shifting in the wind, trying to reassert the atmosphere he controlled so easily in public. His voice carried perfectly across the street without shouting. Step away from the civilians. Saitama looked around. Which ones? Homelander's jaw tightened. Because the command meant nothing to someone who didn't perceive threat or importance. The crowd, the police, the building, it all looked equally ordinary to Saitama. Reporters held their breath. Phones stayed raised. The entire street was waiting for something decisive to happen. And Saitama scratched his head. Are you the manager? Several people laughed again, unsure if they were allowed to. Homelander didn't. He realized something terrible in that moment. This man was not impressed by him. Not scared of him. Not even curious about him. And the world was watching. Billy Butcher had been watching Vought Tower since the first alarms went off. He and were parked 2 blocks away in a nondescript van with a stolen police scanner crackling between them. At first, it sounded like another routine Supe meltdown. Then the chatter changed tone. Words like ineffective, unresponsive, and unknown started repeating over the channel in voices that didn't usually panic. By the time Saitama walked out of the building, Butcher had binoculars pressed to his eyes. He watched the police taser fail, watched 6 officers bounce off the man like thrown pillows, watched Homelander descend into the street to reassert control. And he didn't smile. He went quiet. That's not a Supe, said under his breath. Butcher nodded slowly. No, that's worse. Because Supes followed patterns, ego, violence, fear. You could predict them, trap them, provoke them. This man in yellow wasn't following anything. He wasn't even reacting to the situation like it mattered. On the street, Homelander stood in front of Saitama, trying to dominate the space with posture alone. Cameras were rolling. Civilians were whispering. The air felt thick with anticipation. Saitama adjusted the grocery bag in his hand. So, is there a place to return this around here? Butcher lowered the binoculars slightly. He doesn't know where he is. Frowned. You think he's playing dumb? Butcher shook his head. No, I think he actually is. That realization changed the way he saw the scene. This wasn't a calculated display. This was someone walking through Vought like it was a shopping mall and accidentally exposing how fragile everything inside was. Homelander spoke again, louder now. You are not leaving until we understand what you are. Saitama looked confused. I was just leaving. He stepped to the side to walk around Homelander. Homelander grabbed his shoulder again, harder this time, fingers digging into the yellow fabric. The crowd went silent. Saitama looked down at the hand. Oh, you need something. Homelander pushed. Nothing happened. Butcher felt a slow grin form. Look at him, he said quietly. Homelander's trying. Watched carefully. He's not scared, he's confused. That was the key. Homelander wasn't dealing with a threat. He was dealing with someone who didn't understand why Homelander thought he was one. Saitama gently lifted Homelander's hand off his shoulder like removing a piece of lint. Sorry, I really should go. My apartment's far. Homelander's eyes flickered red again, but he hesitated this time. Not because he couldn't fire, because he realized what it would look like on camera if it didn't work again. He stepped back instead. That was the moment Butcher understood the opportunity. "This bloke," Butcher said slowly, "just walked into Vought and made Homelander hesitate." Nodded once. "That's new." Around them, people were still filming, still whispering. Social feeds were exploding with clips of the exchange. The narrative wasn't about destruction. It was about something else. A man Homelander couldn't control. Saitama finally walked past him toward the street, completely unaware that he had just done something no one else in the world had managed. He had made Homelander unsure in public. Butcher's mind was already moving ahead. If this man wasn't a Supe, if he wasn't working for Vought, and if he truly didn't care about any of this, then he was the most dangerous thing to Vaught's entire structure. Not because he would attack it, because he would ignore it. And Vought couldn't sell, threaten, or contain someone who didn't care. Butcher reached for the van door handle. "I'm going to talk to him." Grabbed his arm. "You don't know what he is." Butcher nodded. "Exactly." Outside, Saitama had reached the edge of the police barricade and was politely trying to step around officers still unsure whether to stop him. He kept apologizing every time someone flinched away from him. He looked like a man trying not to inconvenience anyone. Butcher stepped out of the van and started walking toward him. Because for the first time in years, he wasn't looking at a Supe he wanted to kill. He was looking at someone who might break Vought just by existing. Vought did not like problems that walked away. The moment Saitama crossed the police barricade and started down the sidewalk like a man leaving a store, 3 black SUVs rolled out from a side street and cut off the block ahead of him. Doors opened in synchronized motion. Men in suits stepped out, not with weapons raised but with professional smiles that didn't reach their eyes. This was not a security response. This was corporate containment. Saitama stopped politely. "Oh, is this customer service?" One of the agents approached carefully, hands visible. "Sir, we'd like to speak with you somewhere more comfortable." Saitama nodded. "Sure. Do you know where the exit is around here?" Behind them, Homelander watched from the street with his jaw tight. He wasn't intervening. He wasn't commanding. He was letting Vought try something different because brute force had already failed in front of cameras. Ashley's voice crackled in the agent's earpieces. "Get him inside a vehicle. Do not escalate." The agent gestured toward the SUV. "We can give you a ride." Saitama looked at the car, then back toward the direction he had been walking. "Actually, I live that way." The agent lightly touched his elbow to guide him. Saitama stumbled slightly from the unexpected contact and bumped into the SUV. The entire vehicle slid sideways across the asphalt, tires screeching, before slamming into a light pole hard enough to bend the metal. Everyone froze. Saitama bowed repeatedly. Sorry, I didn't mean to push it." The agents exchanged looks. This wasn't resistance. This was someone who didn't understand how strong he was. Ashley's voice returned tighter now. "Abort the vehicle, just talk to him, stall him." Across the street, Butcher watched the exchange with narrowed eyes. Had joined him, both standing among confused civilians pretending to be onlookers. "They're trying to kidnap him politely," said. Butcher nodded, "and he's apologizing for breaking their car." On the sidewalk, the lead agent forced a smile. "Sir, maybe we can just talk here for a moment." Saitama nodded. "Okay." That alone made everyone uneasy. He agreed too easily. Vought agents were trained to deal with volatile Supes, hostage situations, unstable powers. They were not trained to handle someone cooperative who accidentally caused structural damage by standing too close to things. The agent tried a different approach. "What's your name?" "Saitama." "Do you work for anyone?" "No." "Are you affiliated with any organization?" Saitama thought for a second. "I'm in a hero association, but it's pretty far away." The agents froze slightly at the word hero. Ashley's voice snapped back in their ears. "Get more information, keep him talking." Meanwhile, Homelander stood motionless behind them, watching Saitama talk casually with men who normally trembled when speaking in his presence. He realized something uncomfortable. Saitama wasn't intimidated by Vought either. Butcher stepped closer, listening in now. The agent asked, "What were you doing inside Vought Tower?" "Looking for customer service." Butcher actually chuckled under his breath. Didn't. Because the more Saitama spoke, the clearer it became that none of this was intentional. He hadn't invaded Vought. He had wandered into it by mistake. And still, he had done more damage to their image in 10 minutes than any exposé ever had. A second SUV arrived. More agents stepped out, this time carrying scanning devices disguised as tablets. They slowly circled Saitama, pretending to reposition for conversation while trying to collect biometric data. Every device malfunctioned as soon as it got close to him. Screens flickered. Sensors spiked into unreadable ranges. One tablet overheated and shut off completely. The agents tried not to show it. But Butcher noticed. "They can't even measure him," he muttered. Nodded. "He doesn't register." Saitama watched them fidget with their equipment. "Are you guys broken too?" The lead agent forced another smile. "No, sir, just technical difficulties." Ashley's voice returned again, strained now. "Bring him back inside. Offer him compensation. Offer him anything." The agent cleared his throat. "Mr. Saitama, perhaps we can resolve your issue inside. We can refund whatever you purchased." Saitama looked at his grocery bag. It was just a cabbage. The agents blinked. Behind them, Homelander finally stepped forward, unable to remain still any longer. The agents parted instantly. Saitama turned toward him with the same polite nod as before. "Oh, hi again." Homelander didn't speak. He simply watched Saitama interact with Vaught's most controlled people like they were retail staff. And for the first time, he realized this man wasn't challenging Vought. He was treating it like it had no authority at all. Which to Vought was far more dangerous than hostility. The street had gone strangely quiet. Not because the crowd had dispersed, but because people were listening now. Cameras were still up, reporters still whispering into microphones, but the energy had shifted from chaos to observation. Something important was happening, and no one wanted to miss it. Homelander stood a few feet from Saitama, cape settling in the wind. Eyes fixed on a man who was talking casually with Vought agents like this was a minor inconvenience in his day. Saitama looked at him. "Do you know where a grocery store is?" No one laughed this time. Because Homelander didn't. He stepped closer, voice low and controlled. "You walked into my building. You damaged my people. You don't get to just leave." Saitama tilted his head. "Oh, sorry about that. I didn't know it was yours." That sentence hit harder than any punch could have. Not because it was disrespectful. Because it was sincere. Butcher watched from the edge of the barricade and felt something click into place. "He's not challenging him," he said quietly. "He's ignoring the idea that Homelander matters." Nodded slowly. "That's worse than disrespect." On the sidewalk, Homelander tried to reassert control the only way he knew how. He raised his voice just enough for everyone to hear. "You don't understand where you are." Saitama looked around at the street. New York. Homelander's jaw tightened. He stepped even closer, close enough that most people would instinctively lean back. Saitama didn't move. He simply shifted his grocery bag to the other hand. "You're standing in front of the most powerful company in the world," Homelander said. Saitama nodded politely. "Oh, that explains the guards." The Vought agents glanced at each other nervously. This was not how these conversations usually went. Homelander's presence normally ended arguments before they started. Here, it wasn't even shaping the discussion. He wasn't commanding the moment. He was trying to fit into it. Homelander's eyes flickered red again, but he held back. Cameras were everywhere. He had already used his lasers once. Everyone had seen the result. He couldn't afford to repeat it. That hesitation did more damage than if he had fired. People noticed. Reporters whispered to each other. Phones zoomed tighter. The footage was already being clipped and shared in real time. Homelander, the man who never hesitated, was thinking. Saitama finally sighed lightly. I should really get going, it's getting late. He took a step to walk past. Homelander didn't stop him. He didn't even reach out this time. He just watched Saitama pass by like a pedestrian ignoring traffic. Butcher felt a slow grin form. There it is, he muttered. He blinked. Didn't smile. People saw that. Across the street, a group of civilians began murmuring. Not in fear, in confusion. The narrative they were used to, Homelander controls everything, had just cracked in a way they couldn't unsee. Saitama walked down the sidewalk casually, hands in his pockets now, grocery bag swinging slightly. Police parted without being told. Vought agents didn't follow immediately. No one knew what the correct response was anymore. Homelander remained standing in the street. Still, silent, because chasing Saitama would look like desperation, and letting him walk away looked like weakness. He was trapped between two images he couldn't control. Up above, a news helicopter hovered, broadcasting the entire scene live. The commentator's voice trembled slightly as they tried to narrate what was happening without understanding it. Homelander appears to be allowing the individual to leave the scene. Allowing. The word hung in the air like a lie everyone could hear. Butcher turned to That man just did more to Homelander than we ever could. Nodded once, and he doesn't even know it. Further down the sidewalk, Saitama stopped at a crosswalk and waited patiently for the signal to change. Traffic lights blinked, cars idled, life tried to return to normal around him. Behind him, Homelander was still standing in the middle of the street, staring at the back of a man who had just walked through Vought, through the Seven, through security, and through him without once taking any of it seriously. And for the first time, Homelander felt something he had never experienced in public before. Irrelevance. Within 20 minutes, the footage had outrun Vaught's ability to contain it. Clips of Saitama walking through the lobby while gunfire bounced off him were already circulating with millions of views. The rooftop fight with the Seven had been stitched together from multiple angles. The moment Homelander's lasers failed had been slowed down, zoomed in, and replayed so many times that it no longer looked like an accident. But the clip that spread fastest wasn't destruction. It was the street. Homelander standing still, while Saitama asked him for directions and walked away. That was the one people kept sharing. Inside Vought Tower, media teams scrambled in damage control mode. Draft statements were written, deleted, rewritten. Words like rogue Supe, unknown anomaly, and controlled incident were debated and discarded. None of them fit what people had just watched. Ashley paced in front of a wall of screens, showing social feeds updating in real time. Spin it, she snapped. Call him an experimental hero. Say Homelander de-escalated the situation. A media strategist shook his head slowly. They saw him hesitate. That word again. Hesitate. Vaught's entire image depended on Homelander never doing that. Outside, Saitama had reached the end of the block and was staring at a city map posted near a bus stop. He leaned in close, squinting. Is this upside down? He muttered. A small group of civilians had cautiously followed at a distance, filming him like wildlife observers. They weren't scared anymore. They were curious. The tension had shifted from threat to disbelief. Saitama noticed them and waved awkwardly. "Do you know where a supermarket is?" They pointed wordlessly down the street. "Thanks," he said cheerfully. Behind him, Butcher and watched the entire thing unfold. Butcher's mind was racing now. This wasn't just a moment. This was a structural crack in Vought's control over perception. "He didn't fight them," said. "He exposed them." Butcher nodded, "by accident." That made it worse. Back in Vought Tower, Homelander stood alone in a conference room watching the same clips everyone else was seeing. Not the fight, not the damage. The street. He watched himself from multiple angles as Saitama stepped around him like a piece of furniture. He watched the crowd's reaction, the confusion, the shift. He replayed the moment over and over. Because he couldn't find the point where he had lost control. He hadn't been overpowered. He had been ignored. Ashley entered the room cautiously. "We're preparing a statement." Homelander didn't look at her. "What is he?" She didn't answer. Because for the first time in years, Vought didn't have a category ready. No file, no narrative, no product description. Saitama didn't fit into their system, which meant their system didn't apply to him. On the street, Saitama finally found a small grocery store and went inside. The door chime rang normally. The cashier barely looked up, unaware that the man entering had just destabilized the most powerful corporation in the world. Saitama placed the cabbage on the counter. "This one was bad. Can I exchange it?" The cashier nodded and grabbed a fresh one. Outside, people still stood on the sidewalk, watching through the glass, unsure if they should be afraid of someone who looked this normal after everything they had seen. Butcher watched the scene from across the street and felt something settle in his chest. "This is it," he said quietly. "This is how it starts." Looked at him. "Starts what?" Butcher kept watching Saitama pay for his groceries like nothing had happened. People stopped believing they need to be scared of Supes. Inside Vought Tower, media teams were still trying to craft a story. But the story had already left the building. And they weren't the ones telling it anymore. Billy Butcher did not like variables. Supes were variables you could predict if you understood their ego, their fear, or their appetite for control. You could bait them, corner them, provoke them into making mistakes. That was how Butcher had survived this long. Saitama didn't fit any of that. He walked out of a grocery store with a fresh cabbage under his arm like the last hour hadn't happened. He checked the receipt carefully before tucking it into his pocket, then looked both ways before crossing the street like a man who followed rules. Butcher watched him from across the road and felt something unfamiliar. "Caution." "Right," Butcher said. "We're talking to him." Hesitated. "You saw what he did without trying." "Exactly," Butcher replied. "If he does something on purpose, I want to know before Vought does." They crossed the street slowly, not rushing, not threatening. Butcher approached like he would approach a civilian, not a Supe. Saitama noticed them and nodded politely. "Hi." Butcher stopped a few feet away. "You got a minute, mate?" Saitama shrugged. "Sure." That ease unsettled more than anything else. Butcher gestured toward the direction of Vought Tower. "You just came out of there." Saitama looked back casually. "Yeah, wrong place." "You know what that building is?" Saitama thought for a moment. "Big office." Butcher studied his face carefully. No tension, no deception, just mild confusion. "They're not a shop," Butcher said. "They're the people who make Supes." Saitama nodded. "Oh, that explains the guy with the laser eyes." Exchanged a look with Butcher. This man had reduced Homelander to guy with laser eyes. Butcher tried another angle. "He's dangerous." Saitama shrugged. He seemed upset. That was it, no fear, no respect, just observation. Butcher felt a strange realization settle in. Saitama wasn't impressed by Supes because he genuinely didn't see them as impressive. not in an arrogant way, in a bored, factual way. "What are you?" Butcher asked. Saitama blinked. "I'm a hero." Almost laughed but stopped himself. Butcher nodded slowly. "You don't look like the type Vought makes." "I'm not from here," Saitama said casually. That sentence made both of them pause. "Not from here." Butcher didn't press it. He didn't need to. He could already tell this wasn't someone tied into any known system. He glanced back toward Vought Tower, where media vans were still swarming and helicopters still circled. "They're going to come after you." Saitama tilted his head. "Why?" "Because you walked through their front door and made them look weak." Saitama considered that for a second. "Oh, I didn't mean to." Butcher believed him. That was the part that made this terrifyingly useful. Finally spoke. "You planning to stick around the city?" Saitama nodded. "I have to get home, it's kind of far." Butcher smirked. "Figures." He made a decision in that moment. Not to use Saitama, not to manipulate him, but to stay close enough that if Vought tried something stupid, he would see it coming. "Listen," Butcher said. "If anyone in a suit tries to take you somewhere, don't go." Saitama nodded politely. "Okay." "Promise?" "Sure." The simplicity of the exchange made Butcher uneasy. This man wasn't suspicious. He wasn't cautious. He just agreed like Butcher had told him the weather forecast. Saitama started walking again. "I should go, cabbage gets warm." Butcher and watched him leave. "That's the most dangerous person we've ever met," said quietly. Butcher nodded, "and he hasn't got a clue." Across the city, Vought's media teams were still trying to regain control of a narrative that had slipped beyond their reach. Homelander was still replaying footage of the street in his head, and the seven were sitting in silence, trying to understand how a man who didn't even try had made them all look unnecessary. And walking away from all of it was Saitama, completely unaware that his casual visit had just set something in motion Vought could not undo. Homelander did not return to public view. He went back inside Vought Tower and shut himself into a glass-walled conference room overlooking the city. The damage to the lobby below was still visible from that height. Workers were already trying to clear debris, but the hole in the facade remained like an open wound in the building's image. He stood there for a long time without moving. Not angry. Not shouting. Just replaying the same moment over and over in his head. Saitama stepping around him. Like he wasn't there. In another room, Ashley and the media team were still arguing over phrasing for an official statement. They kept glancing toward the conference room, waiting for Homelander to give direction, to reassert control the way he always did. He didn't come out. Because for the first time, he didn't know what control looked like. On screens around the room, social feeds were still exploding with edits of the incident. One clip showed Homelander pushing Saitama and failing. Another showed Saitama asking for directions. A third showed Saitama apologizing to police officers he had accidentally knocked over. None of them were violent. All of them were devastating. Homelander watched one on a silent loop. He wasn't losing a fight in it. He was being ignored. That was the part he couldn't process. Across the city, Saitama was waiting at a bus stop, reading the route map upside down. A small group of people had gathered nearby, whispering and pointing at him. Some were filming discreetly. Others just stared, trying to reconcile the calm man in front of them with the chaos they had seen earlier. Saitama didn't notice. He was trying to figure out which bus went toward cheap apartments. Back in Vought Tower, Maeve entered the conference room without knocking. She watched Homelander from the doorway for a few seconds before speaking. "He didn't even try to fight you." Homelander didn't turn around. "I know," he said quietly. Maeve folded her arms. "That's what's bothering you." He finally looked at her. He didn't see me as a threat. Maeve didn't correct him. Because that wasn't the worst part. He hadn't seen Homelander as anything at all. In the war room, Ashley finally pushed out a public statement claiming the situation had been peacefully resolved through negotiation. Within minutes, comments flooded in with clips disproving every word of it. The narrative was no longer theirs to write. Butcher and were still parked nearby, watching the city settle back into motion. Butcher checked his phone and scrolled through the clips spreading online. Each one chipped away at the same image Vought had built for decades. "They can't spin this," said. Butcher nodded. Because there's nothing to spin. He didn't attack them, he just walked through. That was what made it impossible to categorize. Saitama wasn't a villain. He wasn't a hero. He was a normal man who made Supes look unnecessary. And that idea was spreading faster than Vought could react. Inside the glass room, Homelander finally sat down. He stared at the skyline and realized something that felt like a crack forming inside his chest. If people stopped believing he was the strongest thing in the world, then what was he? He had built his entire identity on being untouchable, unmatched, feared. Saitama had walked past all of that without noticing it existed. And Homelander didn't know how to fight something that didn't acknowledge the rules he lived by. The first internal report didn't mention damage. It mentioned perception. A senior Vought analyst stood in front of a wall of screens showing social metrics climbing in directions no one liked. The clips people were sharing weren't the explosions, the cracked floors, or the broken lobby. They were moments where Saitama looked confused, polite, and completely unaffected by everything around him. One line in the report kept getting repeated. Subject displays no reaction to Supes as authority figures. Ashley read it twice. Then she understood why this was worse than a violent incident. This man had walked into Vought and accidentally demonstrated that Supes weren't inherently intimidating, that their power depended on people believing in it first. And millions of people had just watched someone who didn't believe. Across the table, a marketing executive whispered, "If this spreads." Ashley finished the thought, "We lose control of the brand." That was when it clicked for everyone in the room. Saitama wasn't dangerous because of what he did. He was dangerous because of what people were learning from watching him. In another room, Homelander was still alone, staring at nothing. He hadn't spoken in over an hour. The usual requests for appearances, statements, or public reassurance went unanswered. He kept seeing the same image. Saitama looking at him like he was an employee. Maeve's words echoed in his head. "He didn't even try to fight you." Back on the street, Saitama boarded a bus without incident. He dropped coins into the fare box and sat near the window, staring outside like a man who had just finished errands. A teenager a few seats back kept glancing at him, phone out, trying to be subtle while recording. Saitama waved politely. The teenager almost dropped the phone. Butcher and watched the bus pull away from the curb. "He's leaving," said. Butcher nodded slowly, and Vaught's terrified of that. Because if Saitama stayed, they might contain him, study him, frame him, turn him into something usable. But if he walked back into the world like nothing had happened, the story would travel with him. And people would keep asking the same question. Why wasn't he afraid? Inside Vought Tower, a final conclusion was written into the report. Subject must be controlled, recruited, or removed from public visibility immediately. They didn't know how to do any of those. And that was the real threat. Not a fight. Not destruction. A man who made their entire system look optional. By the time evening settled over the city, Vought Tower had been patched enough to look presentable from a distance. The shattered lobby was covered with temporary panels. The hole in the facade was hidden behind construction tarps. Employees were told to act normal. Media teams kept repeating the same line about a resolved internal incident. But the footage was still everywhere, and no tarp could cover that. On a bus heading away from the city center, Saitama stared out the window at passing buildings with quiet boredom. He adjusted the grocery bag on his lap and checked the cabbage one more time to make sure it was fresh. Across the aisle, two passengers whispered while pretending not to stare at him. One held a phone low, replaying a clip of Saitama standing in Vought's lobby while bullets bounced off him. They weren't afraid. They were confused. That confusion was spreading. Back in Vought Tower, executives gathered for a final debrief. No one talked about property damage. No one talked about security failure. They talked about one thing: perception. A man had walked into their headquarters, ignored their authority, and walked out without ever trying to challenge them. And millions of people had seen that happen. They couldn't market that. They couldn't threaten that. They couldn't explain it away. In the glass conference room, Homelander finally left his seat. He walked to the window and looked down at the city. Traffic moved normally again. People went about their lives, but he knew something invisible had changed. He wasn't the unquestioned center of their fear anymore. Someone had shown the world what it looked like to not care. And he had no idea how to undo that. Butcher stood on a rooftop watching the skyline darken. Leaned against the ledge beside him. Neither of them spoke for a while. Finally, said, "He didn't expose Vought." Butcher nodded slowly. He exposed how much Vought depends on people believing in them. Below them, life continued. And somewhere in the distance, a bus carried Saitama farther away from the building he had mistaken for a grocery store. He had no idea that his brief visit had started something he would never see. Because for him, it had been a minor inconvenience. For Vought, it had been a revelation. And for the world watching, it had been a quiet lesson. Fear only works if you think it should. Saitama leaned his head against the bus window and closed his eyes, already bored with the day. Behind him, in a city he had barely paid attention to, a system built on intimidation had just been cracked open by a man who didn't even realize he had touched it. And that crack was never going to close again.